Hi, good morning. Welcome to our panel today. Excited to have you all. My name is Stephanie Solander. I am the head of marketing at Neuvik Solutions. We're a cybersecurity services company that specializes in advanced assessment, cybersecurity training and education, as well as integrated risk management. Our panel today for talking about shifting left is made up of members of our training team, Tillery and Josh, who I'm pleased to introduce to you all.
Hey,
Hey,
Stephanie.
Hey, Stephanie.
good to have you both here today. So Tillery is Neuvik's Director of Cybersecurity Training. Tillery has been in the security field working in AppSec and exploitation development spaces for more than a decade. For even longer, they've held formal education and professional training roles in both the public and private sectors. They bring deep technical knowledge and pedagogical training to instruction in cybersecurity, computer science, and mathematics. And with Tillery here today is Josh Mason, who works alongside them as a senior technical trainer at Neuvik, providing courses, engagement management, and business consulting to clients. He's a cybersecurity professional who transitioned from being a military cargo pilot to being a cyber warfare officer in the U.S. Air Force. So, Josh has since taught at the U.S. Air Force Special Operations School and elsewhere. And it's a pleasure to have you both here today.
I'm glad to be
Great to
here.
be here. Yeah, thanks for having us.
Yeah, we're excited. So, I thought we'd open up by asking the obvious question, discussing how we settled on the topic of shifting left. So, when we say that, what do we mean? What is shifting left?
Tillery?
Sure. Yeah. So shift left at its core is the idea of taking elements of the development lifecycle, whatever they are, and moving them into the earlier phases so that we can kind of short circuit some of that overall process of kind of redoing work. And in particular, when we talk about shift left in this context, most typically we're talking about security. And so that takes some of the concepts around DevOps, which is putting operations into the development space, and adds a security element to it, hence DevSecOps. That's kind of the core of DevSecOps, is that idea of shifting left, where rather than having actions that take place later in our development lifecycle or even outside of it or after it, we start to put that into the hands of the people who can act on it the earliest, which is typically developers.
Yeah, I'd like to add way too often in security, we're left waiting until something is found by pen testers or by criminals, and it's expensive and it's costly. Um, if we plan better, then we save money in the long run. It seems counterintuitive, and I think we're going to get into some of the details of why it hasn't been happening. But it, if we can start getting there more often, I think that there are huge benefits.
So, this is actually a concept you recently explored in a series of articles for Nuvik, where you were discussing a T-Mobile case study from 2017, and you're doing it from the perspective of a red teamer, a QA tester, and a developer. So, I was curious, what are those roles when it comes to security, and what made you come to that concept in the first place in the blogs?
Yeah,
Yeah, go ahead,
I'll
Josh.
take the pen tester.
Yeah.
So, for those who aren't familiar, penetration testing is when someone in the security field tries to emulate a criminal, a threat actor, and attacks using tools, a web app and or infrastructure, trying to find bugs that can be exploited to gain access. And there, it's been a rocky road in history for penetration testers, but we're in now a community where that is a standard practice and required by a lot of organizations. Tillery, did you want to cover the software dev sides of those?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things in particular we see in that kind of post-development, post-release space when we are talking about penetration testing or red team testing is that we're trying to start looking at this production space, or in some cases an integration space, similar to the way an attacker would, just as Josh was saying. And as we do that, we're going to find things that were missed in earlier phases of our development or during our release process. And there are always going to be pieces to be found there, whether that is elements that we've agreed are kind of acceptable levels of risk, or that's just something that we've missed because no one can be perfect. That gives us that kind of post-development, post-deployment perspective on security. And a lot of the techniques that tend to be used there are either very similar to the kind of ad hoc testing that some QA testers might do, which we'll talk about here in a little bit. But it also tends to lean into concepts like fault injection, where we're taking known good input and we might change or mutate that to create something that could cause anomalous conditions. And that's a viewpoint that has not quite made it into a lot of the development space, particularly in late QA. One of the things about this push left concept is that we are trying to take some of those ideas that happen in the post-release or post-production space and move it into earlier phases. And that's really what we were trying to touch on during this series of articles, is we wanted to work backwards through time, taking the way that different roles or different groups might target the same vulnerability, to explain how that idea of pushing the problem itself left and finding those problems earlier could contribute to cost savings, time savings, and just an overall more secure product. So that's where some of our QA testing tends to come into play. The major kind of touch that we did in the articles had to do with the test plans that are created, and particularly around the concept of negative tests, where you're not only testing for kind of the good, happy path, but you test for the negative path as well. And that helps you to identify behaviors or corner cases or edge conditions that might not have been thought of during design and implementation. And so that QA or that testing role helps us to look for those things that we missed before we then push that code to production and an evil person could find it. Pen testing also tends to kind of look for those things in a way that we at least, are getting the answer from a good person acting in that way. But the earlier we can find it, the better. Josh, anything that you wanted to add there on the QA side?
Yeah, just for anyone who's wondering what QA means, we use it a lot. I'm used to it as quality assurance, but it's usually one of the last roles in the production cycle, testing to make sure that the things that the developers developed work the way that they're supposed to, and then that they don't work the way that they're not supposed to. Now, that's a lot of... You explained it, built out on a lot of tests, right? So there's going to be tests that are run as a standard practice, the correct inputs, incorrect inputs, trying to match what the developers were thinking when they built it. But there's limits there, right? Of what a QA tester might be looking for. They've only got so much time, right, in their cycle to go through the tests that they need to go through. And then at a certain point, they got to decide, okay, this is good enough. Is that accurate?
Yeah, and that helps to define kind of what done or what good means from the perspective of a thing that we're working on. And one of the concepts that's very common in agile development, especially, is that we go into it, we have a problem we're trying to solve, we have a design that we're working towards, and we need some definition of what done means for that design. We don't want that to just be a checklist, but we do have some prerequisites we definitely do need. And one of those is that we've performed some level of testing, that the amount we've tested it is sufficient. There are lots of different metrics for that we'll kind of touch on as we discuss QA in more detail here in a little bit. But our underlying theme is make sure that everything is correct and identify where we might have missed some of those elements. And
if I
go ahead. Sorry, yeah.
may, if there's a QA role, why then do bugs that become vulnerabilities still exist? For those who are maybe wondering that question.
Yeah, that's a great question. And part of the answer is that humans are fallible, and even things that we augment that process with, like automated testing, isn't going to be perfect. We can do our best to identify the common causes of these bugs or common causes of vulnerabilities. We can do our best to identify where we might have missed a part of the code or missed a part of the behavior. But that's never going to be perfect. And on the flip side of that, there's also the element of kind of new things that we're just not aware of, that we don't know to look for, that end up impacting us in the long run. If we look to kind of the beginning of last year to the incidences that we had around Log4j, as an example, that was a well-known library used by a lot of people. It turned out it had a vulnerability in it that we didn't know about. And it could be difficult to test for those things, particularly in what we call our software supply chain, or our third-party code that we're including as a part of our product. And so even if we do our best due diligence on the things we did right, there's still the possibility that the things we're using have vulnerabilities as well.
That's a good point. The Log4j, I think, is a good example. It's an open framework that actually the code hasn't been really touched in a while, correct? Like it was developed and it's been part of a lot of Java packages, but being a small um, module, it didn't go through like a rigorous QA process, right? It wasn't put out by a company. It was put out by, I understand, a few individual contributors. Is that accurate?
Yeah, there is a QA process that goes into that,
Sure,
as there is with many open source projects. But ultimately, the same problem happens with first party code from an enterprise. You can't look for everything or at everything. Sometimes things do slip through. And when we start talking about these core dependencies that we have, that tends to have a large impact on a lot of things. The Log4j developers have done a lot of really good work, and their work in remediating that Log4j vulnerability was also good and very rapid, especially for a project with so few people. But there's only so much that can be done in that space as well. And sometimes these things do kind of slip through the cracks.
What do you think is like the solution to that? What could have been done to kind of to catch that?
Yeah, there are kind of a lot of elements of that, and some of these concepts of pushing left can help with that, both with respect to this particular vulnerability, and also with respect to some of the earlier phases of the SDLC that we can touch on. So if we kind of start pushing that left a little bit into the developer and the design space, even before we get to the test plan that QA teams are going to be working on, we could start kind of looking at foundationally the inputs and the outputs of different elements or different parts of our application. And that design time kind of perspective would allow us to create more fundamentally secure elements and analyze where the threats or the risks might come into play that could be realized later on. And one of the things that we start to see when we push that further left into that design space, into early implementation, is that we at least know if there is a zero-day vulnerability that hasn't been identified, what that impact would be, and we can minimize that. And that's where some design paradigms that try to do a level of minimization also come into play. Log4j on its own only has access to the context of the deployed application because it's a part of the deployed application. When we start taking a look at some of the modern design paradigms that try for separation of responsibility and functionality, separation of data, like microservice architectures, then even if you do have something like a zero-day in a critical dependency, something like Log4j, you still have a separation and a level of protection. So that gives us both kind of at the library level, when that development is being done, a way to design it in a secure way. But if there is a flaw there, then all the way up our chain, we can make sure that all of our individual components are also created in kind of that secure way. And that knowledge of and acknowledgement of our dependencies and the risk that they bring in is a piece that can be missing in a lot of development life cycles, particularly if we're not doing that design time thinking about security and security implications.
Yeah.
So it's a pretty significant impact, sounds like, from when you shift left in just many places in the organization.
Yeah, absolutely. And particularly in the number of things you find earlier. One of the metrics that we start to kind of look for when we start putting, design time thinking in particular, but also just generally DevSecOps spaces, is a time to remediation that goes down because we have more knowledge of our security space, more knowledge of our application in general, and also the delta of vulnerabilities found in production is naturally going to decrease as well because we're starting to find things earlier. We find them either during our design process through something like threat modeling or a security as design mindset. We'll start finding that in QA as we shift our QA processes to include additional security-focused tests. And as we start to do kind of more and more automated pre-release pen test type activities rather than post-release, we can see an yet more kind of decrease. And so part of it is an idea of defense in depth. As we go through every step, we want to make sure that there's a level of security we're adding, but the more of it we do earlier, the more we're short-circuiting, the more that we're able to remove the fundamental design flaw that might have caused that vulnerability, which means that we can't realize the risk to then cause some level of damage.
And I know we weren't planning to dive into this part, but I can't help but think about impacts of shifting left also contributing to technical debt. We've been building out a course and have a large section on that. And I know you and I spent a lot of time digging into use cases and scenarios for that, but it's even greater thinking about and planning for use cases, thinking about the future. What is the next feature going to be? What is the overall feature going to be? Not just the security mindset, but trying to think long term during those earlier beginning or even any cycle, trying to think, okay, what am I going to have to go back and fix later? Am I going to have to go back and fix security? Am I going to have to go back and change out code that we rushed and now we have to rewrite it? Which, yeah, we got a feature out for this due date, but the next sprint is going to be even harder because we got to rewrite that and add the next feature, right? Fighting that technical debt can be costly for resources and time. You got to hit deadlines. Adding roadblocks to your own plan can be very difficult. And I think if some of the SEC and the now national cyber security strategy end up with teeth to them, where companies are going to be held liable for putting out code that has vulnerabilities, it can be really expensive to not catch this stuff early.
Yeah, there are a few implications to that, both from the debt perspective, the technical debt perspective that you talk about, and also from, as you're saying, some of these kind of requirements that are being put externally and some of the fines that might be associated. I think that the technical debt approach is a really interesting one to talk about from the perspective of pushing left and security, because it's also one of the reasons that a lot of product owners or kind of business decision makers push back against this idea of push left, push back against this idea of putting some level of responsibility for security into the hands of developers, because that means it's yet another thing developers have to think about and dedicate their time to. But what we actually find is a reduction in the amount of time spent in kind of the later parts of the development lifecycle that are less impactful and less effective, because we're able to spend more time upfront designing away the problems that will then, kind of would have identified themselves later. And that is very helpful from a security perspective, because security things are especially costly if they are realized, but it's helpful to really kind of go down a path of understanding the foundational design elements as well. I particularly like, Josh, that you mentioned kind of long-term design thinking versus short-term design thinking when we're chasing an MVP and trying to get an individual feature out, versus making sure that the long-term feature plan meets something that is possible, something that we can do, versus having to do a bunch of rework along the way. And there's always going to be decision making that goes into that. Business decisions around security and around long-term design versus short-term design are difficult to make. One of the foundational changes that needs to accompany DevSecOps as a process and security by design as a process is a mindset shift to understanding that these things are important and that we have buy-in not just at the developer team level, which adds responsibility, but also at the product owner level and the product management level, and all the way up to the individual product groups who then have their own sets of metrics and their own responsibilities and have to report back up eventually to the CEO. We need a way to really give the understanding and empowerment to these development teams, starting really at the top and pushing down. And the end goal of that should be that we have an organization, a security organization and a development organization that, rather than being an externality and trying to push things in, is really supporting the things that we're already doing because the priorities are set appropriately. And so at that point, I like to think of it less as pushing left and more as pulling things in from the right and trying to really do those things the correct way, because the mindset is there that it's everyone's ownership. Ownership of security by every member of the organization that touches the development at all is really what we're going for, and we'll never have great security until we have that buy-in at every level of the enterprise.
Oh yeah. I always think of things from a pilot mindset. There's a very similar thing. So developer teams in each sprint are focused on that sprint, right? It needs to then be part of like leadership's guidance to make sure that they understand the bigger picture and like the end goals, and then focus their sprint to reach not just that sprint's goals, but the overarching
Set up the stage for
requirements.
what comes next. Yeah.
Yeah, there would be a lot of days where people would, man, there were a lot of long, like 16-hour flying days in Afghanistan or all over, where at the end of the day, it'd be like, we moved a bunch of boxes or pallets of pallets. To move stuff around in the back of a C-130, you have to have a pallet, and then you stack stuff on there and strap it down and like wrap it into all the stuff so that it won't go anywhere. Well, every once in a while, you end up with one location that has received a lot of stuff, and now they've just got a stack of pallets. Well, those pallets need to make it back to a place where stuff can be put on them, and so you end up spending a lot of your time, sometimes it feels like, just carrying pallets of pallets, or sometimes pallets of the same tires. People will even like, some people would write numbers on them to try to identify, like, wait, have I seen this tire before in my plane? And they'd come in from a long day and be like, man, I feel like we got nothing done. But that's because they're looking at their small section, like their 16-hour day. It was tiring, it was hot, it might have been freezing cold. It's always extremes. And they're wondering, okay, what was the outcome of this? The sprint might, accomplish something. We got out this feature, we rushed it, but like we lost sight of the big picture. Mm. If that one day of flying, if they don't take it a view of like the big picture, like each C-130 flight takes like 10 or 12 trucks off of a road, and driving on those roads is the dangerous part. And it's part of this bigger mission and part of a bigger strategy. And like that plays a section. It can be really disheartening. Also, then you lose sight of like, okay, my excellence here helps the excellence overall. So if we can start planning that earlier, a lot of that planning also comes down to individuals. So if someone in the middle, is looking at a whole region and trying to plan out like where the planes go, and they lose the forest for the trees, they can also end up doing stuff where we end up with regression, kind of the same way that a dev team, if they start going down chasing a feature, might have to come back and change a language. Same thing with, you chase a feature, now you realize, oh, we forgot to add authentication, we forgot to add encryption, now we need to go back and do that. Does that become a sprint, or does that become technical debt that we need to deal with later? And that can be difficult if the planning doesn't happen before the execution.
I think
sorry, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead, Seven.
I was going to mention that actually on LinkedIn, we had a poll we did recently where we asked people what they felt was the most difficult part of shifting left. And a lot of people said it was understanding of the problem. And as you mentioned, if you don't have that understanding at the start, then it's very difficult to follow up, I'm sure.
Yeah, and I think there are several parallels kind of that I want to draw out from what you said, Josh, that touch on, first the direct analogy you were making, this kind of short-term thinking, long-term thinking, and big picture. One of the things that we see a lot, or that I've seen a lot in the organizations I've worked with, is that even within a given sprint, a given feature, a given product, we tend to have silos of knowledge or silos of information where, the one senior architect has a big picture thinking of the entire product, but they might not know the depth of any particular section. And then each individual developer knows their piece. They know the thing that they work on most commonly, but they don't know how that links into other systems or kind of the big kind of design decisions that were made to cause them to work on the thing that they are. And that siloing of knowledge can be very helpful in that you are the expert at the thing that you're doing, but it can also really damage the overall view of security as data flows from one function to another, as data flows from one service to another, and can make it so that no one really understands completely what the security implications are, or even the functional implications are for a given product. As we do start to shift security left, as we start to consider these things earlier and earlier, we necessarily start sharing that knowledge, because as we take actions like better designed test plans that need to have end-to-end visibility, QA is going to have a better, deeper understanding of the entire application rather than focusing on just unit tests, just particular areas of our code. Developers are going to start performing earlier planning and design, things like threat modeling activities that necessarily mean understanding data provenance and data scope, and making sure that they know what's coming to them from where, how it's protected, what those important pieces are. And that kind of knowledge sharing becomes huge in the same way that, the day-to-day understanding why you're flying this plane today impacts tomorrow. It's the same idea for the big picture of an application and for the long-term plan of an application. So I really like that kind of piece of what you're talking about really heavily. The other side that I kind of wanted to touch on from what you were saying is that as we think about the kind of implications of connected pieces and of long-term design, that gives us an opportunity to, really talk about the roles that we have. You have, your pilot who is flying the thing. You have people loading it. You have people making decisions on what gets loaded. And all of that process is invisible to the individuals for the most part. One of the very strong issues we tend to see with a push right mentality and with DevSecOps in general is that we have this external security organization dictating things that you have to do and pushing new responsibilities in. Earlier I kind of touched on that idea that push versus pull mentality is very important. The other thing that's really important is that it has to go both ways. We can't just say development has to have a security mindset. We need to push the other way too. We need to say security needs to start thinking in a developer mindset and understanding what developers are doing and how they do it. If we don't have that kind of Scrum-based mindset and that kind of push for an understanding of feature design and business requirements as a part of the security mindset, then we'll never have truly coherent connections between them. That's also why things like security champions are so important. They are able to help bridge that gap and really bring in the knowledge from both sides and create a community of practice within an organization that pulls security into development and pulls development mindset into security by being that bridge between them.
What do you think is a good way of getting security to start thinking like a developer? Because I know I end up running into a lot of people who are starting out their careers in security or trying to develop their careers in security. Do you think that there is a benefit to adding a sense of learning some of the Agile or Scrum or just the overall software development cycle in order to then be able to empathize and kind of translate a little better? Do you think that's valuable?
I think that there's definitely a lot of value in kind of skill propagation and cross-training in general. And I think that that's true from a kind of development into security and also from different sides of security into each other. So I'll put a pin in that one for a minute and we'll talk about security and development kind of integrating. I think that there's definitely a lot of value in that. And that's part of why I see some of the best security folks coming from a site reliability engineering background, where they understand not just development, but also infrastructure and uptime and how all of the pieces really fit together. They then shift into security and start to understand how those pieces fit in. And a lot of I started as a developer. I was a developer long before I was a security person. And before that, I was a mathematician. So I think that a lot of that mindset shift has helped me in the way that I've been able to present this. The other side of it is that I don't think it's practical for everyone in security to have been a developer or spent time as a developer. I think that the number and amount of security expertise that we need, it's just not possible. But I don't think that means we can't bring a developer mindset to security. I think that means we have to change how we go about it. And a lot of that is how you position security in an organization, how you position your central security, your global security organizations within a larger enterprise. And I think that the true way to solve this problem is not to have security forcing development to do anything. I think it's to set the right priorities and the right incentives within development teams that they want to use security as a part of that. And then security becomes a factor that is not kind of building responsibility, but that is giving capability, that they become a customer to the development team, because the development team comes to them with their problems rather than security going to the development team. And that's, again, that idea of kind of push versus pull. It seems like it's semantics. But if you're setting your incentives such that the development team wants to meet a security goal rather than has to meet a security goal, and repositioning your security organization as that contributing, augmenting power rather than that enforcement power, that's going to drive a lot of the security that we want to see and a lot of that mindset shift that we really need. Ultimately, the only way security is going to be successful in development organizations in the long run is if the culture is there to support that. And I think that the way a lot of organizations are built today doesn't support that because of that us versus them mentality.
Makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. So we keep talking about developers thinking about security. Is there a framework or model for this process? Would that be threat modeling?
Yeah, threat modeling is definitely a foundational kind of element of security, and it's a process and a framework to allow us to go from a early phase into something that comes out as secure later. I think that it's part of a larger picture that is DevSecOps. And DevSecOps should have at every phase of our development lifecycle a transformation from just a system development lifecycle into a secure development lifecycle. At every phase in our SDLC, we need to have security inflection points. And often these are called injection points by organizations where we're injecting security in. Coming from a math background, I prefer to call them inflection points. They're points at which we can go one direction or the other. And rather than trying to push something into them, we have that point of inflection where we're bending slightly towards security.
I like that. Less of a contradictory or instigating or fighting, but instead like injecting into the process. I think of like if you were to add trout to a stream, you know, just like that's contribution or contributing. You know, you add them into the process. It's not like a problem. So if we can have them understand that bringing security in doesn't ruin what they're doing, isn't a problem, it becomes part of the process. Is that kind of what you were thinking with injection? Just in my less eloquent words.
Yeah, so I think when I hear and when I say injection, it feels like we are kind of pushing a needle in and forcing something in, right? And so that process causes an immune reaction, and that can be a very kind of difficult thing to work around. And so a lot of organizations will describe adding these security points as injection. I tend to lean more towards, again, the word inflection. It's a point at which we can deflect or bend slightly in a direction rather than pushing something in. And if we think about the development lifecycle as a living thing, then it's like introducing antibodies rather than injecting in a virus. And it's the ability for the system to kind of create around itself the security that we want. So we need to position these things as augmenting capabilities. And if we start all the way at the right, we start with pen testing. Pen testing is very much an us versus them mentality where these outsiders are coming in and testing our thing. And so if we shift those techniques slightly to the left into our QA space, at that point, we're working directly with our defenders on our blue team, and we're working directly with our developers in our QA space and augmenting that. So we take what was a fairly complete test plan created from some mix of code coverage-based and behavioral-based testing, and we inject into that something new, but in a easier way. So rather than injecting it in, we're kind of bending that process, and we introduce new test methodologies in. That's where some of this ad hoc testing, the things that are being done by pen testers anyway, can be put into the hands of QA so that they're finding these things, they're identifying and fixing these things. As we start to look at things like automated testing, the way that static application security testing like source code analysis can work really is going to help us to augment the capabilities we already have with a level of automation. It can't replace the humans because the heuristics that a tool has and the knowledge and context it has will never match that of a human, but it can augment that capability. And that continues as we move earlier and earlier in our process. The more we can augment that and kind of influence and bend that as an inflection point rather than an injection point, the more we'll be able to really lift this. And the strongest possible of that is threat modeling. I love talking about that. And so I know that we have that ticker down at the bottom, but before I jump into my threat modeling soapbox, did you want to add anything there?
No, I love it. It's when mission planning, everything goes back to plans for me. So when mission planning, you think about all of the risks while you're creating the mission. So what's the weather going to be like? Where are we landing? Is there a threat? Like, might people be shooting at us when we land there? All of these things go into, okay, let's then make the decision of if we're going to go, how we're going to go, when we're going to go, all those things. And a big part of your planning, though, you need to worry about, like, okay, how much gas do I need? Like, what's our route going to be? Like, who needs to be there? What needs to be in the back? A big part is trying to decide, okay, what are our threats and how are we going to mitigate or avoid them? And it just seems natural to me from that point of view. But if it's not part of the plan, like if I'm going to the grocery store, I don't think about like what all the bad things could be, because I've gone to the grocery store a bunch of times. I just go, I have a list, I buy stuff. Sometimes I don't have a list and I forget stuff. But there's a lot of things that we just do and that we don't necessarily feel like we need to think about all the worst case scenarios. But for me, it makes a lot of sense that in what we're doing with development, with creating software, that it would be very valuable to think about, okay, well, where could this go? What is the worst case scenario of what I'm building? Like, how could someone use this maliciously against us? How could someone use this maliciously against our customers, our clients, or our users? And it makes tons of sense to me, but I got this feeling that it might not be obvious to most people. If I might, Stephanie, you've got a neutral stance in that. I feel like your experience, it's not military, it's not strictly cybersecurity. What's your take on that idea? Does it seem like it would be difficult to change the mindset to be thinking about like worst case scenarios?
I think in any industry, there's always that concept of risk and management. I think even from a marketing standpoint, you put together a campaign, you have to think of things of what's the reputational impact of this decision, what's the financial cost, and does that actually result in the financial benefit we want? And it's smart, I think, in any time when you create a plan to come at it from what could go wrong as much as what do I want to go right. So it's funny because when, cybersecurity is not my background, but hearing you both talk about threat modeling and going over the blogs that we've done in the past with one another, a lot of it does speak to that common sense. So it's very interesting how a lot of things I think are universal across a lot of industries.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that there's also that idea that when you're going to the grocery store, you don't really think about and you hope you don't have an adversary. But when we start thinking about marketing, where we have different companies in the same space that aren't necessarily adversaries, but aren't also necessarily allies, or when we start thinking about warfare, we definitely, it's easier to view those problems than it is in some of these scenarios. And I think that's one of the core things that you're speaking to, Josh, is that in software, for a very long time, we've been thinking about it like going to the grocery store, not like going to war. And I don't want a developer to think that every time they're writing code, they're going to war. But, anytime there is a user of an application, there is the risk that user is malicious or that even accidentally or inadvertently does something damaging. And anytime you have code, anytime you have, data, if data exists, there's the risk that the wrong person gets that data. If data transfer exists, there's the risk that someone intercepts that data. And that's what threat modeling is really getting to. There's this difference between there being a risk of something happening and it occurring. And so that's also the difference between a risk existing and a vulnerability realizing that risk, right? A vulnerability is going to come in and allow an attacker to take advantage of the risk that was there. Our goal as security experts, and the goal of threat modeling and the goal of any security activity during development, is not to make there be zero risk, because there can't be. If there's data, there is risk. Our goal is to make that risk small enough that the cost of attacking is higher than the value you get from the attack. And that's where we have ideas like strong cryptography. If we have a piece of data that only lives for 30 seconds, we don't need the same level of cryptographic intensity. We don't need the same algorithms that take longer to execute as we do for something that needs to be protected for 10, for 20 years. And that's why we might use really complex elliptic curve for some things, and we might use, 1024-bit RSA for other things, because ultimately the level of protection we need is going to differ. And understanding that is a core part of threat modeling as well. We want to make sure that we've identified the things that are highest criticality and that we push that risk down, such that we kind of target those most important things first. And we can't do that if we don't know that they're there. And that's a lot of what pushing left is really about. It's not necessarily about finding new things, although if we find them earlier, that's great. It's about understanding them earlier and prioritizing them and pushing them down as early as we can. And ultimately, design time thinking is the best place to do that.
You said highest criticality. I'm thinking like quantitative or qualitative analysis. It sounds like there's a hierarchy of these things. And I'm saying this as if I don't actually know how dread works. But do you mind explaining a little bit of the details of what do you mean by like criticality or highest criticality, or how you would identify or rank those things?
Yeah, and there's lots of ways to do that. There's lots of methodologies that exist. One of the ones that we see most commonly in, for example, the security community is CVSS, Common Vulnerability Scoring System, which is great if you have the security knowledge, the security background to apply that, to go over its 3 different sets of metrics. But that can be very heavy lift for something like a development team. And so we often need something that is a little bit simpler. Threat modeling, when we're talking about design time thinking, is kind of split into 2 portions. We have the identification of the risks that exist, and then we have the prioritization of those risks amongst each other. And we need some method to do both of those things. There are lots of different threat modeling methodologies. Some of them try to tackle both problems. Some of them try to tackle one side of the problem, leaving the other to some other method. The most commonly deployed threat modeling methodology is something called STRIDE, which is focused on identifying sets of threats and risks within these categories, these 6 categories of spoofing, tampering, repudiation, information disclosure, denial of service, and escalation of privilege. And that's purely an identification-based methodology. So we need some other way to give a criticality. And I mentioned CVSS as one of those ways. There's also something called probability impact ranking, which is a very subjective measurement. We're just giving 2 numbers. How likely do we think this is, and how bad would it be if it happened? Kind of sitting in the middle ground between them is something that you just kind of referenced in what you were saying, which is DREAD. And DREAD is a fairly common methodology to be paired with STRIDE, in part because both of them were developed at Microsoft, and in part because both of them fit together well. DREAD is an attempt to put objectivity to that subjective measure of probability and impact. And so it has 5 sets of metrics that it then puts numbers to. And we can kind of split those 5 sets of metrics into groupings of probability, how likely the thing is to happen, and impact, how bad it would be if it did occur. And on the probability side, we have discoverability. How easy is it for someone to find out that the problem is there? We have exploitability. How easy is it for them to actually attack the thing once they know about it? And reproducibility. How easy is it to do it again after the fact? And we bring those 3 metrics together, and that gives us a concept of the probability of this attack occurring. And then we have our damage potential, how bad the thing is, and affected users. How many people or how much data or how much kind of user space does it impact? That gives us our impact metrics. And so that's a way of putting objectivity to that subjectivity. Some threat modeling methodologies take a different tact to it. Trike, for example, has a concept of crown jewels of data, of information that need to be preserved. And so in the trike perspective, we have a set of actors. A subset of those are favored users. And favored users are those actors who are allowed to touch the protected parts of our data in some way. Not necessarily completely, but in some way. And then we have a subset of our data model that is our assets, that is the crown jewels, the things that we need to protect most strongly. By creating our understanding of which of our favored users are allowed to touch those protected pieces, that naturally gives us a definition of security. And then we can define how bad it would be if that weren't to happen. That gives us a different way to measure criticality.
What would be an example of crown jewels? I've got an idea, but just in case someone is tuning in or listening and they're like, what do you mean? Maybe they're not as savvy on information security. What are... I think of like health information, personally identifiable information, credit card information, maybe intellectual property. Is there system information or anything else that you would include in that?
Yeah. So ultimately, what we're going to define as an asset, or what we define as a crown jewel in a crown jewel based methodology, is going to be based on what has inherent intrinsic value to itself. And that itself is a hazy question, because does PII count or not is going to be based on whether you consider PII to have value. The cynical viewpoint is, of course it does, because if we leak it, we get fined, and fines are money. So the cynical viewpoint is that that thing has value because there's money attached to it. The people first perspective is that thing has value because if it was released, it would do damage to the person whose information it is. But in both of those cases, we can identify PII, PFI, financial information, PHI, health information, as an asset that needs to be protected because of a level of damage that would be caused if it were to be released. What is not a crown jewel is something that doesn't itself have inherent value, but exists only to protect something else. So one of the things that we often will think very strongly of protecting is credentials, username and a password. That does need to be protected, but not because it itself is an asset. It's not. On its own, it has no value whatsoever. But if someone were to gain that, they could then target, they could damage an asset, they could gain personal information. And so as we're thinking about security, as we're thinking about the implications to things like tampering or spoofing from Stride, or things like targeting of these critical pieces of data, these assets in a methodology like Trike, we want to focus in on the thing of value itself. Implicitly, that will then tell us we must protect this thing. And the way Trike does that is by saying, does a mutation of a particular step in our process allow for damage of one of these things we've said needs to be protected? So if we're saying the PII needs to be protected, and we have a step in our process which is that a legitimate user submits their credentials for authentication, if we were to perform a mutation on that step, something that Trike calls hazardous operations analysis, and say that we have an actor other than the one we intended, now someone else is submitting those credentials on behalf of this user, we're not asking, is that damaging the credentials? Because the credentials have no value. Right. We're asking, does that variation of that step allow damage to one of our assets? And the answer may be yes. It allows for the viewing of personal information. That is the actual thing we're protecting against, not the credentials themselves. Now, naturally, protecting the credentials becomes necessary, but not for their own sake, for the sake of those other assets. And that's why...
Sorry.
I was going to say, and that's why Trike, in the way that it creates its security objectives, which are the things that violation of means a security problem has occurred, is in terms of those protected assets. It starts by saying, what are they and who should have access to them? That allows us to say, this particular asset, PII, should be conditionally readable by users. And the condition that we apply to it is only their own. We then invert that and we say, if something other than the intended behavior was to happen, would that be, how bad would that be? That allows us to give a criticality. And the measurement of criticality then and the prioritization comes into play from something measurable. Often when we're talking about criticality with respect to these crown jewel-based methodologies, we have a mix of monetary value and reputational value. If something were to cause reputational damage to us, we also want to be concerned about that. And putting that in a measurable term can be difficult. So often what I will do is say, if we had to pay a PR firm, how much would that cost? And that allows us to put a monetary value to reputational damage as well.
Yeah.
By saying how bad it would be if that thing were to occur, that allows us to create sets of rules based on the things that are highest criticality. And so we'll reach for the things that are a high level of damage first and base our rules on those. If that isn't enough, if we need to create additional layers of security, we'll take those medium-weighted things and say, for the things that are a medium impact, create rules based on that. Those become our security objectives. And the security objectives are things like, a user should not be able to access PII for any account other than their own. If they were to do so, we would thwart that attempt. That's the rule that we create. And if something ends up violating that rule during either normal operation or during that mutation, that hazardous operations analysis, that tells us there is a security hole here that we need to fix. We need to come up with a mitigation that doesn't allow for the damaging of this asset that we determined to be of high value. And maybe for our authentication case, that means we don't trust just a username and a password. We have a second factor of authentication that also needs to be owned. And maybe that on its own isn't enough because we determine that that can be bypassed in some way. This allows us to define what defense in depth is necessary and what acceptable levels of risk are based on those security objectives that we've created. And so maybe we then perform mutual authentication. We don't just have the client authenticate the server and the server authenticate a username and password, but the server authenticate the user device as well and have some second layer like asymmetric encryption or signing keys that allow for that. And all of that comes down to what is acceptable versus what is excessive. Security is always a balance between functionality and protections. And we need a way to measure that. Different threat modeling methodologies do it differently. We've talked a little bit about DREAD for for Stride, and then Trike with its own internal mechanism.
Yeah. So this doesn't seem that terribly complicated. It's new information, but like it doesn't seem that crazy for of a concept. Why are we talking why isn't it already happening? Why are we talking about it as if it's something that's new? Because it's not new, right?
Yeah, well, so threat modeling as a concept certainly isn't new. Stride was developed by Microsoft in 1999. It's been around for a long time. It was in somewhat heavy use for a while, and then it fell off, and then it's come back into vogue. Ultimately, it's a shift in our mindset. It's a shift in how we consider the responsibility for security. For a very long time, if we had cross-site scripting, we put a web application firewall in the way, and that WAF solved the problem for us. Yeah. Now we want to shift such that, what if somebody bypasses that WAF? Or what if it doesn't work correctly? We need to solve that problem at its foundational starting point, the design of the application. We need to fix our input parsing. We need to fix our input validation such that it's not vulnerable to that particular issue. And that shift in mindset and that shift in where we solve the problems is what's bringing these concepts back into play. This idea that if we can foundationally, fundamentally solve the problem during the design phase, we don't implement something that's insecure. And if we don't implement something that's insecure, we don't have to redesign or add an external mitigation because we've already fixed the problem. And that's why it isn't happening, or it's happening less than we would hope to see it, is these are processes that have been solved in other ways. The other side of it is it is time consuming. It takes time to do this. It saves time in the long run, but that's a hard sell for a lot of developers.
I've got an economic idea look at it. Do you think that the community would prefer that we spend the time and the effort and the money to develop secure programs, or do you think that there has been enough demand for products and enough supply of products to bring in security after the fact, that the focus hasn't been on fixing the root cause, but instead on creating better bandages?
I think that depends on which
point fingers, but what? Yeah,
yeah. I think that's a question of which industry and which part of the industry that you're looking at. I think that there is a large amount of security product space that is trying to solve the problem after the fact, or add a band-aid, some kind of external mitigation. And those things aren't inherently bad.
Sure.
If you create a perverse incentive to make it so that they're more valuable, I think that that's bad. And there are certainly parts of the community that do that. I think that, my idealistic brain says that that's not the majority of the community. It says that, we're creating these products because there exists a problem. Me as somebody that is largely concerned with solving the foundational issue, partly because I've been a consultant for most of my career and that's what I do, but also partly because my motivation is to create a more secure world in general. The more we can remove the foundational problems such that externalities aren't required, the better off we'll be, for multiple reasons. One of them is, no matter how good your external protections fail. They also are going to add attack surface. If you have a vulnerability in the product that you're deploying, you've now created a vulnerability in your space that wasn't there before the product was there. So there's pros and cons to deploying these things. I mean, take a look at vulnerabilities that we've had in virus scanning software that is deployed to thousands of computers, right? If the parsing of incoming JavaScript has itself a vulnerability in the way that parser works, and suddenly I can send you a web page that gives me system level access to your Windows computer, that's worse than the cross-site scripting ever would have been, you know? And
I was thinking recently efile.com, a browser, when you've got a certificate issue, will show the hey, this page isn't safe. And then what attackers were doing is using that page, then when people would click through, that would actually send them to the malicious site. And so now what's meant to be secure and warn people and help keep them safe is now an avenue for being attacked, for the attacker. I think about SolarWinds. It's not a security tool, but a lot of organizations kind of included it as in their tool set, right? That's how they're going to push their updates and monitor. And it kind of ends up in that similar space. Yeah. But then if they get...
so you actually have two separate problems there, which is one, adding a mitigation that can lead to a problem, like with SolarWinds, like some of those other elements. And the other is where we have defenses, attackers are always going to look for what they can do next. So if we're looking at something like a copy of a certificate warning page, right, that is identifying that there's a protection in place. How can we bypass that? In a similar way, we'll see malicious websites that will full screen your browser, but have at the top of their web page rendered in HTML, in CSS, something that looks like the top of a browser, but isn't, such that when you start to interact with what you think is the browser, you're actually interacting with their web page, and they can do all sorts of things to it. Yeah. That comes down to that kind of push and pull, or the cat and mouse game of security, where we are creating protections, we're creating mitigations, but those protections and mitigations are then the target of an attacker. If we can solve some of the underlying problems of security, then those later phase elements aren't going to be as easy to target, or won't be the target. And so that's a space that kind of is where this push left concept comes in. As we do look later in the process, that absolutely also needs protections. To talk about kind of the ultimate push left from a security product perspective, we could think about compilers. Compilers themselves have added security features over time. When I'm compiling C code, for example, it used to be that the stack frame for my program could be smashed by a very large input, and there was nothing we could do about it. Well, then we came up with this concept of stack canaries, this thing that we put there as a part of our compilation process, as a part of how it executes, to do that level of protection. And so we see, even in our fundamental tools, security being added. And I think that's a big theme that we want to kind of pull out from this, is that wherever we are taking action in a piece of software, we want a level of security to be present there. If that is our compilers, then it's our compilers. If that is our development and our design time, we want that element of security there. And the more we can do that, the better. And often that's a very hard problem for designers of software or designers of tools to get behind or to understand, because security is a complicated thing. Sometimes you need that external party to come in and tell you what that looks like and help you train that. And that's a lot of what I've spent my last year doing. The majority of the trainings that I do are targeting developers and development teams, not security professionals. You know, it used to be the beginning of my cybersecurity training career was focused very heavily on cyber skills, reverse engineering, vulnerability analysis, exploit development. And I still do some of that. But the majority of what I do today, where I view it as being more impactful, is targeting developers at their organizations and teaching them what security means, teaching them how to implement security. And I hope to continue doing that for the next year, for the next 2 years, because the impact that I see from doing that is just so much larger than the impact I saw teaching security professionals. Not to say I don't like going to conferences and teaching. I'll keep doing that too. But, you know, there's room for both spaces.
We have pitched that we might be spending a couple days in South Dakota focused on this issue. And we just finished work on this course that includes this and a little more, including some leadership and some other thoughts in the area that we'll be presenting next month. So, have been enjoying really diving into this with you in my time here at Neuvik and today. Excited to see where we take this and who else we can teach and kind of foster this in our community again. Because I love to see the pendulum swing and stay over here and like thinking about security from the beginning.
And mediums like this are such a great way to do it too. And so hopefully, you know, I definitely want to continue doing these, you know, webinars and presentations and that sort of thing, because the level of knowledge sharing that you can do in a forum like this is fantastic.
Agreed. It's great listening to you both. I feel like I always gain a lot every time I just sit back and I listen. And before we go, did you want to share where our audience can find you online and offline?
Sure. So I am at Tillery everywhere, ARETILLERY. You can also find me on Neuvik's website. Obviously, I feel like I have to plug that, but you know, I'm Tillery everywhere online, and offline I'm in Central Maryland. But if you're in the area, let me know.
And I'm Joshua17SC or just Josh Mason on LinkedIn. That's where I'm most easily found. And if you have any questions, feel free to just send them our way. We'll, if we get some really good ones, we'll put together another one of these focused on those.
Yeah.
Thanks for putting this all together, Stephanie.
Sure. And actually, Josh and I will be at Hack SpaceCon this weekend. So if you will be in Cape Canaveral, come and say hello. Actually, you'll be giving a talk, won't you, this weekend?
Yeah.
Josh?
I'm giving a talk on Saturday on how to implement a debriefing into the team's engagement process to methodically iterate and kind of like a Scrum or Agile retrospective, but to iterate from engagement to engagement and actually make sure that improvements are occurring in an organization. So, yeah.
So
hope to see folks there.
I'm excited to see it. So if you enjoyed the live stream or you had any thoughts we didn't get time to go over, as we already mentioned, feel free to leave a comment for us. We'd love to go into more topics with you. If you want to read our insights on Medium, we did mention the blogs that we did recently. You can go to blog.neuvik.com to read on Medium, or you can go actually to our LinkedIn, where we've also shared it as several articles. If you want more content like this, please feel free to follow us on LinkedIn or on Twitter, where we're at Neuvik. And you can subscribe to our YouTube channel as well, which is Neuvik Solutions, and see any other upcoming videos or live streams. So anything else you want to say before we wrap up?
This has been fun. Let's do it again too.
Great.
Let's do it.
Thank you all.
Thanks everyone for coming.